Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles 24/8. I'm Allison.
And I'm Erica. And before we start, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, or stream us on Spotify and on YouTube. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we're back from our summer break. Before we get into our very exciting episode today, a little bit of note on our giveaway. We had over 230 entries. Crazy. I think you guys set a new record for our giveaway. The prize, of course, was a vinyl or CD copy of the new Mind Games remix album, and you guys really turned out. So we had 3 winners, and congrats to Mikhail, Cassandra, and Courtney. And you will be receiving your album shortly, and we hope that you love your prizes.
Yes, congratulations. We loved Mind Games. We hope you love it too.
Yes.
Let us know what you think.
Yeah, please.
And now that we're back from our summer break with new content, we are so excited to welcome Madeline Bocaro.
Yay.
Madeline is a music journalist with a lifelong admiration for Yoko Ono. Her new book, In Your Mind, The Infinite Universe of Yoko Ono, tells the story of Yoko's amazing life, struggles, art, activism, films, and music in astounding detail. The book dives deep into Yoko's life before, during, and after her relationship with John, highlighting her childhood in Japan during wartime, her art, films, music, and work for peace and women's rights. It also explores the misunderstanding and undeserved negativity that Yoko Ono has received throughout her life as an Asian woman and as, of course, the wife of one of the Beatles.
And the book has received rave reviews. Spill Magazine called it the Bible on Ono. Can't get much higher praise than that. It's also earned a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Library and Archives. But perhaps most telling are the comments from those close to Yoko herself. Elliot Mintz, who we talked about on many different episodes this summer, who is Yoko's longtime friend and former publicist, said this book is a masterpiece. It's mandatory reading for anyone seeking insight into a woman like no other. And Sean himself, Sean Lennon, commented, "We love your book. It's beautiful. Thank you for caring enough to be so meticulous." And this book is definitely that. It is fantastic. And we're so happy to have you today, Madeline. Thank you for being on BC the Beatles.
Thank you so much to both of you. I appreciate it.
Of course. We're so excited to talk about this. We've been Yoko fans for our entire lives. We've talked about her positively as long as we've had the podcast. And we're excited to really dig into her life, not just as a member of the Beatles' Four of Wives, but as an artist and a feminist in her own right. So very exciting.
Great. Let's do it.
Let's start, though, with you. Your personal history with Yoko, both as a fan and as a personal friend, is long and unique. Tell us about that.
Well, my first sighting of her was in Time magazine. There was an article about her film Bottoms, and there was a picture of her face standing in front of one of the frames of the film. And she had this little mischievous smile, and I thought she was really beautiful. And I was 10 years old, so I'm like, wow, she did something funny as an adult. You know, all the adults in my life were serious. You know, my parents were much older. And here she is, you know, making a film of Bottoms. And I just thought, this is great. And I cut the picture out. I still have it. And I was like, wow, I wish I could find out more about her. Next thing I knew, about a month later, the White Album comes out. And there's all this talk about John Lennon's with this Japanese artist. And I'm like, oh my God, I think that's her. So that was it. I'm like, this is great. So I started, you know, jumped right in, like everything they did together, the Two Virgins album I got, you know, and of course caused a furor at my house with my parents.
Because you were a kid, right? You were young.
Yeah, I was 10, 11. And then, you know, carrying the White Album to school. And the kids in school wanted to peel the white off the White Album because they thought John and Yoko were naked under it. But even I knew that.
Wrong album.
That's a different album. I have that one at home.
That's the one in the brown paper bag, yeah.
Right. Eventually, you know, they jumped right in doing the bed-ins and the War is Over posters and the concerts. And I just listened to all this happening over the radio, over the TV. They were always in the news. So it was great. I felt like it was a part of underground history as it was being made, you know. This is why I felt that I had to put this all together, I was writing about her all my life, whether it was for my own notes, like every time I'd see a concert, I'd write down a whole set list. When I went backstage, I'd write down everything we talked about. I kept every interview from all the British magazines, particularly because they're the ones that let her speak. Most wouldn't even talk to her. So I had a whole archive of saved articles and audio and everything. And when COVID hit, my boyfriend said, here's this software, put all your stuff in these folders and you can organize them and see what you have. And right away, I saw that I had a 500-page book. But then it took like another 2 years to really sequence it and flesh it out and make it work.
I think what makes your book really unique, too, it's the breadth of sources. I was really impressed because, a lot of book quote the Playboy interviews and some of the Rolling Stone stuff. It was very, very impressive, the rare interviews. So I was curious, too, about that, how you access those. But it sounds like you just collected them.
Yeah, I saved them all. All of these magazines are defunct now. I have the actual pages, and I luckily kept it in chronological order, just put it on the top of the folder every time. So that was really helpful.
It's like you're born to write it.
Yeah, I guess so. People go, how did you do your research? And I'm like, it was all in my head, what needed to be said. And I just referred to my archive to grab it. The purpose of the whole book is to bring forth her spirit and wisdom and to kind of like let the genie out of the bottle. I feel like she's this wealth of wisdom and she's been kept inside for so long. And I just wanted to bring out what she's trying to do, which is show us that we can get what we need ourselves, which is ultimately peace and love. And we can grant our own wishes. She's just pointing us the fact that we're misplacing our values, valuing gold over water. She just comes at the world from a whole different place. She points out that invisible things are important, like air. Who thinks about air? But without that, we're done, right? We are in our neighborhood, in our country, and the world, and she's in infinite universes. It's just beyond.
I love the way that in the book you weave so many of those quotes that Allison mentioned, those rare quotes. It's almost like you and Yoko are co-narrating her life, you with the prose and her with the very long direct quotes, and it really helps you get to know her.
That's great. Glad you're getting that effect.
As far as Yoko herself, let's start at her beginning. She had a very interesting childhood. How do you think that shaped her?
Oh, it totally shaped her. It was harrowing just from the loneliness alone, right? I know being an only child that I was lonely, but, I had parents around, friends. But she was from one of the 3 wealthiest families in Japan, like the Rockefellers, right? And her great-grandfather had built a billionaire fortune in banking. And billions in the 1940s was equivalent to probably trillions now. So this is how wealthy they were. And her father wasn't so wealthy. He married into her family, her mother's family. And he had to abandon his career as a concert pianist for banking. And she didn't even meet her dad until she was 3 years old because he was working in America. So she's raised by servants. She was treated as their superior because, in Japan, they considered themselves higher above anybody because they descended from practically royalty, So they told these servants, don't cuddle her. She's your superior. You just, serve her and don't speak to her. It's very strange upbringing. On top of that, when the Americans bombed Tokyo, she had to be evacuated with her younger siblings to the countryside. And her mother had purchased a farmhouse, not thinking it was in such bad shape, but it was really dilapidated and it had a hole in the roof and they were foraging for food. She had given them kimonos and jewelry to trade for food, but the townspeople there turned their noses up at them because they were so rich. And they wouldn't give them anything. They threw stones at them. There was a family that she saw go into the woods to forage for wild mushrooms, and they ate these mushrooms and got poisoned. I mean,
oh my God.
She's only 11 or 12 years old at this time, and then she gets driven back to Tokyo on this rickety truck with her siblings, and she sees Tokyo smoldering in ruins.
That's so much tragedy. And then on the other hand, there was a short story in the part I was reading that the son of Emperor Hirohito had a crush on her. She could have had this totally crazy royal life, She She just had access to so many things, and she chose the life of the mind. It's very interesting.
That's right. And when people say, she jumped onto John's coattails for his money, she gave up all that money. She didn't want any of it. She didn't stalk him. She didn't know who he was. It just happens, People need to learn that she was only good for him, really.
Yeah. One thing that sets your book and yourself apart from a lot of Beatles authors is how you came to Yoko. You can talk about being exposed to her via Bottoms first. So you got to know Yoko, the artist, before you even knew about the Beatles connection, which I think is really special because, when, Yoko obviously grew up a bit, she became a prolific artist. Her art is amazing. She's one of my favorite artists as well. Let's talk a little bit about her as an artist. So when she came to art, what kind of themes did she first want to communicate?
She was so damaged and everything in her life was so transient. Like she couldn't hold on to anything. It would burn or it would be destroyed or she'd have to move away from it. So that's why her art is all, you can't really buy it. Like what artwork can you own? It's an apple on a stand. It's a word on the ceiling. It's an idea, an imagination. She was just trying to communicate and to heal herself and others. It was all therapeutic. She was always misunderstood. The performance art receives a little more reaction, but the avant-garde would look down upon her because she was putting out like emotion into her work and they were all like kind of cool-headed. So she didn't really fit in anywhere. And it was a man's world. So, she fell in with her first husband was Toshi Michanagi, who her parents disdained also because he wasn't from any wealthy family. And they didn't even go to that wedding. She just had to elope with him. And was a student of John Cage. And the three of them with Mayuzumi, they went on tour in Japan. And she was in the middle of this men's world again. And she had to break out of that. That's why she came to New York.
You titled the book, the first part of the title is In Your Mind. And I really like that because I felt like I understood a lot more about what her art meant and how it was almost participatory, that there's a back and forth between her and the person experiencing the art. Some of it is left unfinished so the viewer can take it up in their own minds. And that's so interesting.
Oh, yeah. It's a give and take. And the way I got that In Your Mind title was the exhibition where she met John, her first exhibition in London at Indica Gallery. There's a brochure for it. And I have one of these, and they're really rare. And mine is signed by her, which is really nice.
Wow.
Inside of it, there are some pages from her book, Grapefruit. And I had this thing like, okay, I know what this is. I know what this says, right? And I never really flipped through those pages. But when I was putting the book together, it fell open. And there's a page that said, if you burn a chair, the chair in your mind doesn't disappear. But the words in your mind were left out of the typewritten text, and she hand wrote them in. And they jumped out at me. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the book title.
That's so cool. You touched on feminism just a bit. I want to return to that because it's such an important part of her story. And today, when every day in the news we're seeing women's rights being attacked, her perspective on feminism is even more important to hear than it has been for maybe a couple of decades, really.
Oh, yeah.
How do you feel her feminism influenced her?
It was a rebellion. She had to break out of it because she even said at the beginning of this concert, she was introducing herself and she wrote this piece called I Learned to Stutter. And she felt that she was a highly confident woman. She thought she was relatively good looking. She had a good sense of herself. But when she got together with John, people were telling her, oh, you should just curl up and die, go away. You're stealing our idol, whatever they were saying. And she got so affected by all this that she started to stutter.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It shook her to the core. And her grandmother, her paternal grandmother, she went to a French school in Japan. And she was part of a very important feminist group called the Blue Stockings.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, they were in England, but she formed the Blue Steps in Japan. So this is going back, and she was very strong and she pushed boundaries. And her mother was an equally strong woman, but she was more of a socialite. but she did play instruments and she was very artistic. And even John came from a family of very strong women. His mother and her 4 sisters, especially Mimi, she had to with him to raise him, right? And
Right.
it's amazing that these people who came from strong women in their childhoods, who eventually abandoned them, which wasn't necessarily good, but, you know, they had to face discrimination as they got older. It was kind of backwards. And the funny thing she says about, I love this quote. She's a Playboy in like December 1980. It was the day before John was killed. She says, "You ask any woman, no woman ever went through penis envy. We never did. The books they were supposed to. But look who wrote the books. We never had penis envy, but men do have womb envy because we're directly connected to life and we give life."
Thank you, Yoko. I love that.
Yes.
Yeah.
The only time in my life I've ever seen Yoko was actually at the Women's March the day after Trump's inauguration in 2017. So it was just so wonderful to see her there, continuing, still out there.
Yeah, she's there. Oh, that's sweet.
I also love, on the subject of Yoko talking about penises, one of my favorite things she's ever said is how she pointed out that like men have this appendage on their body they can't control. And I heard that quote when I was, you know, still pretty young. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true. And it sort of like leveled them for me a bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think about that sometimes still, that quote. So you brought up John. And of course, we've got to talk about John a little bit because this is a Beatles podcast. And as much as we'd love to talk about Yoko and could talk about Yoko forever, let's shift into that a little bit. So a lot of Beatles fans still have this, like you said, a really skewed version of her in their heads because of her association with John. But looking at the meeting of John and Yoko, did she really not have a familiarity with him? And there's debate about that. But in her artwork, in her avant-garde lifestyle, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't be on her radar, right?
Yeah, I described that in the book. Look, she was 33 years old in 1966 when they met. And there was no such thing as rock and roll when she was a teenager in the 1940s. She didn't have a record collection. She didn't go to nightclubs. She was working as an artist in Japan and New York. And she was interested in atonal and 12-tone composers and, you know, traditional and Japanese music, Indian music. She was more into this cultural music than not pop at all. She never heard of that. And she was staging events and making avant-garde films. 5 years before meeting John, she hosted performances by avant-garde musicians at her Chambers Street Loft in New York. It was called the Chambers Street Series. It was a big thing. It's kind of like her own little Meltdown before Meltdown existed. And John was still in the Beatles with Pete Best on drums during this, you know. And when the Beatles first came to America in 1964, she was staging events. She had published her book, Grapefruit. She had performed cut piece at Carnegie Recital Hall prior to their first concert at Shea Stadium. And one thing is funny, in Rolling Stone, she's talking about the band was reminiscing about their Shea Stadium concert. And she said to them, well, what were you doing in a baseball stadium? And they said, well, we played sold-out concerts here. She's so wrapped in her own work, she's oblivious that they were the biggest band in the world. So I believe her. I mean, people don't believe her when she says she didn't know who they were. And Yoko, one thing about her, she never lied. All her memories, everything, every recollection of whether it was her own event or a Beatles event or hearing the first Beatles song she heard was at an artist party. And she heard Strawberry Fields. They played it for her and they said, oh, what do you think of this strange pop music? And she said, oh, I think that's really cute. It's interesting that they're going in that direction in a pop song. So why would you lie, you know?
Yeah, and I think people forget Yoko was a musician herself.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was a classically trained pianist. Yeah.
But I wrote this little thing. I didn't put it in the book. I guess I thought of it later. It's just a paragraph, and it says, an intelligent and creative woman from a wealthy family attended Sarah Lawrence College in New York. She had been married with a young daughter. She divorced, then married one of the Beatles. They were inseparable. Because of this, she faced ridicule, blame, and cruel discrimination. After the Beatles broke up, she encouraged her husband to tour with his own band. Her husband insisted that she be in the band as well. He wrote many songs about her. They worked together to create a better world. I'm referring to both Linda McCartney and Yoko Ono. These are only a few of the parallels in their lives. The difference is that there was more cruelty directed towards Yoko. The media wasn't kind to Linda, but the blatant lies that they spread about Yoko were exceptionally hurtful.
That is so true.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of us forget the parallels. After the whole Get Back documentary and also Let It Be coming out recently, I think people kind of, I don't know, I've been seeing a bit of a shift in the way people think about both Yoko and Linda, sort of seeing them both for what their real roles, in the recording studio and at that time, which is that they both sort of were similar. They just were kind of like hanging around, not really interfering so much. So I think it's really important to remember they were both there. And if you have reverence for Linda, then you should probably equally think of Yoko as a non-threatening entity at that point.
Yeah, I mean, they were at each other's throats already. And here's the thing. I don't even know how I found this quote, but she was speaking with this photographer, Richard DeLello, in 2009. And she wasn't pleased when he decided to leave the Beatles. It was 6 months after their wedding. And she was concerned that her artistic freedom would be compromised if he wasn't preoccupied with the band. She's thinking, I'm an independent artist. What am I going to do when he's going to be all day with me? Like, what do I do? And top it off, he said to her, now it's just you and me. And she felt a shudder go through her. Like,
she's like, oh no.
She didn't know that they could jump right in and merge, and he could become an artist and she could become a rock star, and you can't even tell the difference between the two of them, right? They hit the ground running, and they just worked really well together. But she was like concerned.
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating passage in the book. It's always a point of contention. I mean, even still, when Beatles fans talk about Yoko, her involvement, if there was any in the Beatles breakup. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, I went to my first Beatles fest, and they always used to play Let It Be as a bootleg in some back room, And there's that lovely scene where George is playing I Me Mine and John and Yoko are waltzing. And some dude put his hand up in a gun motion.
Oh, terrible.
And it was horrific. I walked out. I was so upset by that. And to see that, and that was still just 10 years ago. And I think things have changed now, but it still just illustrates that it's still pervasive among a certain set of fans. So hearing her have this other reaction that has nothing to do with breaking up the Beatles, and she wanted them to stay for her own sense of artistic autonomy, people should hear that. I do think that's interesting, though, because how do you reconcile that independence with what people always argue and what they say, that she was in the studio all the time, that John put a bed in there when she was recovering from her miscarriage? Like, how do you counter that image of her among people who are still thinking that she broke up the Beatles?
I just say that John wanted her there. She would have been perfectly happy being at their apartment or their house, whatever, working on her next work. In fact, she's doing that in the studio. She's drawing, she's writing notes constantly. She's thinking of her next thing. She's bored, she's knitting. She's not looking over Paul's shoulder and saying, don't play that note. I mean, it's so stupid.
Yoko and her mail correspondence was one of the funniest things in Get Back.
She had a lot of paperwork. Yeah.
Yeah, she's always writing, always thinking. Yeah.
There's something you say in the intro, too, that I think is really interesting. And I'm paraphrasing, but you say that without Yoko, we wouldn't know John as the legend he is today. So thinking about her relationship with John, how do you think she actually shaped him into that enigma?
She just told him, be you. I mean, he didn't do anything at her direction except realize, hey, I don't have to do this. I can be myself. And, I was the Rawlers and now I'm John. That's it. And that's all he needed. It's just wake up and get out of that Beatles situation and the dream and the adoration, which did him no good. It was stifling. She was having him communicate with more people that way, one-on-one. He would speak to the media even more. He was just opening up. In the first solo album, he's laying it all out there, and they're doing it together. I just say he wanted her there. She said he used to bring her into the bathroom with him. He was so insecure and just so needy, and she was just over it. That's why they had to split up, because it was too much, too overwhelming after many years.
I can imagine. No partner will ever ask me to go to the bathroom with them, and I will never say yes to
no
that.
thanks.
Nope.
No thanks. You talk about John being insecure and needy, and that's something that has been one of his, I don't want to say it's character flaw, I think it's a character element. I would argue that without Yoko there to sort of like encourage him and to give him self-confidence and sort of like say like, yes, you can do this, John, like believe in him. That's kind of what elevates him to like that artistically legendary status. You know, obviously he wouldn't have written Imagine without her.
Correct.
That's been proven. I think she deserves a lot of credit for sort of just being that foundation for him that he needed throughout his life.
Well, here are two illustrations of what she had to work with John, okay? So one quote is from Klaus Vormann, bass player, right? Plastic Ono Band. So he says, up until the time Yoko came into the picture, John, even with all his success and money, was a frustrated, helpless creature. When Yoko appeared, he bloomed. It was an amazing thing to see. For him, that was the revolution. Yoko was not only his lover, she was like a mother to him, and they did everything together. He was so close to this woman, it's impossible to imagine. And then Yanov, who did the primal scream therapy for them, he spoke in Philip Norman's book, and he said the level of his pain was enormous. He was almost completely non-functional. He couldn't leave the house. He could hardly leave his room. He had no defenses. He was falling apart. He was just one big ball of pain. This is someone the whole world adored, and it didn't change a thing. At the center of all that fame and wealth and adulation was just a lonely little kid.
And you kind of see that even in the last photo shoot, the Annie Leibovitz shoot, that Yoko was fully clothed and he's naked and he's in the fetal position around her. That need for her, it's visceral in that photo.
Yeah. And then even Yano said later that, you know, they were halfway through that therapy and they went on to the next thing. They thought they were done. And he said, I really felt like he was walking around with an open wound because we never really finished him.
Oh, that'd be so difficult.
So let's talk about the 70s. The 70s are a very interesting time for John and Yoko, a rocky time. Of course, there was an 18-month break when he went off to LA and New York, and he was living with May Pang. And I think from the outside, this already seemed like a shocking turn, given how publicly they were together, the bed-ins and everything after the Beatles breakup. But I think what made this appear most unusual was how Yoko sent him away with May Pang to be not only assistant, but romantic partner. And I've always wondered what was going on in Yoko's mind at that time, and how did she come to a decision like that?
So, you know, not having spoken to her about this, because I certainly didn't, but just from knowing her and just from following everything they did all their lives every day, is May was their assistant. She was very competent. She was very trustworthy, very smart. And John had cheated on Yoko, and that was the last straw. Besides the government pressure, trying to save the whole world, which they couldn't do, just the smothering nature of their 24/7 relationship. So she's like, okay, this is it. I need a break. So instead of letting John go off on his own, who didn't know how to write a check or carry cash or do anything much, and have 5 other women take advantage of him and write books about it later, she said, let me send May out there with him to look after him. I mean, there's so many more wild situations these days with plural marriages, all kinds of things going on, where this woman basically sent her husband. He was going anyway. They decided to go to LA. So they went to LA and they were on the phone every day together, in touch with each other. And John was always just trying to work his way back to her. There's a whole piece in the book about who actually reunited them. And it was Paul. He came to Yoko and he said, what's going on? You're both not together. Can I do something? Do you still love each other? And she said, well, look, you know, he needs to start from scratch. He needs to court me again. He needs to treat me right. And, you know, we'll work on it. So Paul went out to John and delivered that message. And John did just that. And he worked his way back slowly. He was a mess without her.
You know, when you describe it like that, it really seems like a very logical and rational way for Yoko to deal with it. And talking about their togetherness from her perspective, the stifling nature of it does seem like something that would probably make you go mad after a little while. So I can see how that was best for me, best for him. Okay.
Yeah, especially an artist who had to put her work on hold. Even though she was collaborating with him, it came to a point where she was really just making albums now with him. And so he went out, and right away she went on a concert tour of Japan. You know, she was free and expressing herself again. She needed that liberation.
Right.
Comes back to her idea of feminism too.
Yeah.
Side question for you. You bring up Paul, which reminded me, this is totally antithetical to everything we've been talking about Yoko, and so far as she didn't know about the Beatles and that kind of thing. But there is a rumor that she tried to get with Paul before she met John. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Absolutely not. No. What happened was, it was John Cage's birthday, and they were assembling a bunch of manuscripts from all different composers. And somebody told her, go get something from the Beatles. And she was realizing, oh, they must be big, you know, whatever. And she ended up finding Paul first. And of course, Paul is notorious for hoarding all his lyrics and things. He won't give anything.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, oh, go see John Lennon. And before she could do that, he appeared at her gallery the night before her opening, and they met. So that's how that went down. And there's an audio diary that Yoko made in 1968 while the Beatles were recording. And you hear her saying, you know, I'm really intimidated. John and Paul are so close, but Paul is being nice to me. He's kind of like an older brother. So I feel like it's cool. Like, she was like that. And just from knowing her, I know that Paul's not her type. She had a type, and his husband, you know, Tony, kind of had, though he had the round glasses kind of, and the John kind of look, and even her Japanese husband, Toshi, there's just a suave, sophisticated look about them. And Paul was cute, you know, but I don't think she would have ever gone for Paul.
I just had to ask. So moving, of course, to the end of the relationship, really, because Yoko was there, she witnessed the horror of John's murder right in front of her, which cannot even imagine what that was like. That elevated her to a new status, which was really the keeper of his legacy. You know, she became a part of the board of Apple. She, to this day, her with Sean, she became his voice and his real symbol in the Beatles' business dealings, you know, standing up for his interests with bandmates who she might have not had the best relations with, but also she might disagree, you know, on Beatles dealings. How did she manage that transition into the new role and taking on this loaded role in her life?
So she kind of looked at it as a chess game, and she just had some knowledge. Maybe it was inherent because her sister ended up in banking as well and took on her father's business. So she had some kind of intuition about money, and also investing in things that you love, or things of magical powers like Egyptian art. She felt that that was always going to be valuable. And as far as the business dealings, she just learned how to play the game. And she would even try to like intimidate them by going to an Apple meeting, eating an apple. She really knew what she was doing. And she sorted out John's finances. She built up a fortune for him. What was he going to do? He didn't know. He would have hired another attorney who would have probably ripped him off. So she built that up for him. It's been 40 years now without him. She put all of her work on hold for at least 10 years in order to release his music and present his art in galleries and get him known as an artist as well. She first started with the Lost Lennon tapes, and then albums, and later the remastered box sets that she always had supervised completely because she knew how he would have wanted them to sound. So she became his supporter and went into her art again. First time was in 1989 with a retrospective. And then now her exhibitions are all around the world again.
One thing that really struck me in the book was that you mentioned just the math, that her relationship with John was only 12 years of her life, and she's now over 90. But at the same time, her goal when she started out was to be very much this independent artist in her own right. Did she struggle with having become so associated with John instead of being associated with her own works?
The way she put it was that she's now in the shade of this beautiful tree, and she relishes it. They loved each other so much.
Yeah. It's funny when you talk about how she sort of managed his legacy and made him a fortune and that kind of thing. I think about after his death, we probably wouldn't have, say, lithographs of his art without Yoko. I think she valued his art in a way that maybe he himself didn't even. But one thing I also think about is when I was younger, that she struck a deal with, do you remember the deal she struck with Carter's and had the John Lennon collection with the baby clothes and that kind of thing?
Yes.
Yeah. That's cute.
Yeah, that just sort of came to my mind as something that was a really unique sort of collaboration that I wonder what her thought was behind it. I mean, his illustrations are obviously very whimsical, some of them, and they lend themselves well to it. And I certainly bought it, but, it's just one of those interesting things.
Yeah, I don't know what she was thinking. I know she colorized a lot of that and put out the lithographs. But yeah, I don't know how she related it to children's wear. But yeah, she's really all about healing and nurturing, and that's what her men's pieces are about. She, the broken cups, mending them together, bandaging, wrapping. She wrapped those lions in Trafalgar Square. She has a weird way of showing people, hey, I love you. I just want everybody to be happy. And she has it all symbolically. And she said the sweetest thing once. She said that John woke me up from my mind game. She said I was always talking in symbolism, but he said, what do you really mean? Tell it to me straight. And he woke me up from my mind game. So that was really cool.
You always like to hear how people balance each other out, especially when they're both so powerful.
Yeah. And even her Twitter platform, it's like the ultimate self-help.
I love her on Twitter. Yeah.
And in my book, I use a lot of those tweets and a lot of her like little messages from fortune cookies that are real. You have to stop and think, wow, let me put this in my mirror and look at this every day because this can help me. So I just always see her as somebody wise that's unfortunately been silenced.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said, Erica, too, about how it's like participatory art, because it's like everybody can gain something from her words. I think that's what's really profound about her.
She was almost made for a medium like Twitter.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like haiku. She can write a one-liner and you can sit there, history isn't what happened, it's what didn't happen.
Right.
Right. Like she'll say, no cloud can cloud us forever. Or, start with feeling love for the problem. You will then know what step you wish to take.
Oh, I read that one yesterday and I loved it. So nice. Did anything about her art or her philosophy in art change after witnessing John's death, or was it always pretty much the same types of themes and values?
Yeah, I think she never really wavered. She did more about violence, which she never had really gotten into before. She did the bullet hole piece, and she, of course, did the billboards with John's bloody glasses on them and the album cover. But her mission's always been the same, just healing people, bringing us together, peace, 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 feminism, communicate. Art is life. That's her whole thing. It's not to be hung on a wall and admired. It shouldn't have monetary value. It's a tool for our healing.
So were you surprised to learn anything new about her through the process of writing your book?
The thing I probably learned, it was to a degree of how much hatred was spewed at her and how many lies were written. Because I'd heard it all along, but I've just seen it become so vicious. And one of the interviewers who I asked permission to use her interview because it was never published, and it was beautiful. I said, well, why wasn't this ever published? And she said, oh, they rejected it because they said I needed to dirty it up. And they wanted me to say that she abandoned her daughter and she turned John onto drugs.
Wow.
And that's when it started to become more revealing to me, like the depth of it. And it used to really upset me. But one time we were backstage at a concert and she was reading her review of her album, and her song was called It's Time for Action. And they said, it's time for aspirin. And she started laughing. And I'm like, okay, if she can laugh, it is pretty funny. Okay, now she's laughing, I can laugh at it.
That is funny.
And the thing that other people would really be surprised is that she has an amazing sense of humor. They see her depicted as this weird woman wearing black, as a devil, a black widow, or whatever they say. But she's so funny. And John was so drawn to that humor. They used to laugh every day. Both of them were so highly intelligent and highly witty. And that's what she misses most of all, that dialogue they had.
Okay, so side question, I just thought of this. And okay, so last year when Now and Then came out, there was a lot of gossip about how the tape came to Paul and Ringo. And everybody was saying that there was a rumor that that particular tape had the words "for Paul" written on it. And nobody knows if that really happened. But did Yoko ever confirm or deny that?
She didn't, but I read somewhere that it wasn't true.
Okay.
I'm reading everything. And I read that wasn't true. But when she, had given them Real Love and Free as a Bird, she said that I felt like it was my opportunity to reunite them. So that was beautiful. And people they don't realize this Now and Then. It's about her. The songs on Mind Games that everybody's raving over now. Mind Games is so great now. Yeah, well, what is it? It's all songs about her.
Yeah, Sean said a lot of that too in the publicity for Mind Games. He was really highlighting how it made their love seem very strong. Even though it was a rocky time for them, you could hear the love through all of those songs.
Exactly. Yeah. And that love story is through the whole book. It's not just a Yoko biography. And there's chapters about every album and every song of hers, with and without John. And they're not just in the back like it's a discography. They're in the place in her story where they happened and where they make sense. The most important chapter to me is called Premonitions. And it shows all the prescient feelings and warnings that she had. It's very chilling. It's eerie and like supernatural, all these coincidences and predictions of the future flickering throughout her life. One thing that really blows me away is they had been in Greece in 1969 and they had been taken to a palm reader. And she had said, oh, John is going to be killed on an island. So they're in the Greek islands and they were going to go on a boat with Donovan the next day. And they said, let's just go home. So they came home and then thought nothing of it. And then decades later, she's interviewed by this documentary guy in Greece. And he says, do you remember what that palm reader said? And she said, yeah. And he goes, well, do you realize it was the island of Manhattan? It's a video and you see this wave of like, oh my God, going over the face.
Oh, it's awful. That's so chilling.
It just turns your stomach. Wow.
So last question, I think for me, what new impressions of Yoko do you hope readers will come away with after reading your book?
I hope they'll just see that somebody can be very sincere, genuine, and innocent and not have to have a horrible negative side to them. And it's so crazy that they were painting her in this light the whole time when she's really not guilty. You know what I mean? Like she's so not what they're making her out to be, and also like get some value out of what she's teaching us.
Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely. And I'm so glad we still can too.
Yes.
Yeah.
She's still online and she's still present.
Mm-hmm.
I think also through her retrospectives, I know right now there's one on at the Tate Modern, which I just missed it. I was in London over the holidays. But through those, that people are gaining this new insight into her artwork. And I can only imagine it's really fulfilling for her as an artist first to finally have some recognition in that way again, for her art.
It's very important to her, and going through those white spaces and participating and experiencing and finally getting the meaning children are loving it too. It's very simple. And the glowing reviews are like out of John Lennon's shadow. In Vogue, it says, Tate Modern's reimagining of Yoko's work, the Beatles are beside the point.
Yes.
So,
I love it.
That's great.
Yeah. And I think in the last few years too, there have been so many wonderful like portraits of her in the press. There was an article, I think maybe a year or two ago in the New York Times that was just an amazing profile of her that really like elevated her beyond the Beatles. And I'm just so happy whenever I read those kinds of pieces because it's, she really deserves that. And obviously now with your book.
I hope more and more people read it. I'm trying to do as many podcasts as I can and get it out there. And her colleagues are loving it. I've gotten messages from people who've worked on her films in the 60s.
Oh, fun.
Say, oh, wow, I read the chapter on the films and I worked on that thing. I didn't even know what it meant. And
That's so cool.
That's so funny. Well, We are so grateful you came on our podcast today and talked to us about Yoko. Such a great opportunity to explore her life again. And we'll take any opportunity, really.
Anytime. I'd love to speak to you again. And I hope I get to meet you at my talk at Englewood Library.
Yeah, speaking of that, so where can listeners get the book and follow you online? And do you have any events going on?
Well, I'll tell you about the event first. John and Yoko's immigration attorney, Leon Wild, has a son who is the mayor of Englewood, New Jersey.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And he ordered my book. It got to his home just 2 days after Leon Wiles passed away at age 91. So I was so upset that he didn't get to read it. But his son and his family are enjoying it. And I am going to be doing a talk at Englewood Library on October 7th at 7 p.m. And I think you can go to just northjersey.com, like things to do, and click and get free tickets to that. And I'd love to see you there and everybody else. Signed hardcover books are only available through me at conceptualbooks.com. The softcover is available there also, but it's also on Amazon worldwide. It's also at bookbaby.conceptualbooks.com. The book's website to read the reviews, see more podcasts I've done, a lot of pictures, excerpts, is inyourmindbook.com.
Excellent. And we'll put all that in the show notes too, so people can click right to it. I will be at the Englewood event. It's very close to me, so I'm super excited.
Awesome.
That is great. And if you ever make it out to LA, that's where you can find me. And I would love to grab coffee and talk more Yoko.
That'd be great. I'm there sometimes. That'll be good.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. This has been so much fun. And we hope that everybody will check out Madeline's book. It is really, really the definitive Yoko profile with a lot of Yoko's own words. And thank you guys. Thank you for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, please subscribe on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating/review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, TikTok, and YouTube. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com too. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.